Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from the Break It Down Show. Today's guest is Peter Van Buren. Peter and I are friends. We go back over 10 years. We worked in Iraq together, working in the same unit and supporting one another and the unit with the information that we gathered from the field. Now, Peter's book is called We Meant Well, which is a great laydown on what he saw working for the State Department as all of the failures in Iraq started to mount up. He tells a candid, honest tale, which is sort of what he does today. Today, he's a commentary. He focuses on commentary. You can find him on Facebook, and you should absolutely follow him because he's going to do things like actually read the Mueller report. And even before it comes out, he took a look at what was coming out and saying there's no collusion with Russia, and it's not going to be there. And so here's what's going to happen from the left, 1, 2, 3, and he lays out what happens, and sure enough, it happens that way. But he's also critical of the right, and you'll hear him talk about his criticism of President Obama, President Bush, etc. So don't think that he's trying to sell one side over the other. What he's trying to sell is critical thought and how we all can approach these problems and look at them rationally without party. And gosh, I appreciate that. I don't want to have party clouding the very hard decisions we have to already make. So maybe you will or maybe you won't enjoy the episode, but you should listen, especially if you get pissed off, because I promise we're going to give you that. We also talk about the candidates. We talk about draft dodging and putting that into real context because honestly, we've got to evolve that conversation. So I think you'll enjoy this conversation with Peter Van Buren and myself. As always, thank you so much for listening. Look, you guys are my friends. I love talking to you. So reach out and engage with me. If you're out there and you're wondering if I'll talk to you, I will. Hit me up on Twitter. Email me, pete@breakitdownshow.com. Nice and simple. I will respond to you. And tell me what you think. Tell me what you want to hear. Tell me who's out there. I would love to hear from you guys. Thank you again so much. We love making this show, and you guys all make it possible. Thank you.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Moranis.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Peter Van Buren, and this is the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, this is awesome. I love having Peter on. So for those that haven't followed in the past, Peter and I worked in the same building, often in the same projects, often would see each other out and about on the battlefield in Iraq. And it's funny how our lives have gone in different directions, yet we still continue to connect. We also both sat within, when we were in the office, within 100 feet of Chelsea Manning as she labored with the burden of what to do with what she was seeing on a day-to-day basis. And I know you and I both, we saw similar things that made us unsettled. So it's always great to get a fellow, and I'm going to call you a warrior because you went out and you did it and you know how hard that stuff is. But it's always interesting to talk to you and get your perspectives. I don't want to call you a town crier, but you're out trying to bring sense to things, right? Yeah. And it's fine to disagree with you, but when you read the Mueller report, when you look at how we accuse politically certain people, but don't hold the same standard to our own political side, you have no problem calling that out. And I really appreciate you doing that.
It's something that has put me in a very odd place, Pete, because I came back from my time in Iraq. I was with the U.S. State Department, and I wrote a whistleblower book called We Meant Well, exposing the waste, the fraud, the mismanagement, the just insanity of the so-called reconstruction program that I worked directly with, and you were in and out of. And when I pointed that out, it just seemed to me like the most obvious thing. What I tried to tell people is, I don't know if he even count as a whistleblower, because if anyone had stood next to me, they would have seen the same things. And in fact, thousands of people did know everything I knew. There was nothing secret in that. But yet, just simply saying what's true and what's not true seems to be an extraordinary act these days. And it's gotten only more extreme in the last 3 years, when it becomes very, very difficult to simply understand what is going on. The Mueller report is a great example. It's written down. It's all there. You can sit down and read it or have it read aloud to you. And yet there seems to be this amazing, almost black and white disagreement about what those words have to say. And the more you try to read and the more so-called intelligent people or formerly intelligent people whose commentary you follow, the less you seem to understand about what the actual content of that report is. And in those times, simply telling the truth, as someone else has said, becomes a radical act. And I'm proud to claim some credibility there.
Yeah, there's a radicalness to this. And we're really bad at assigning someone an agenda and a party, instead of listening to what the rational, practical conversation is. I often have the conversation. Like, I didn't vote for President Trump. I don't care for how he approaches problems. I've always thought he was too erratic to be a president. And I think he will eventually go down. And I can name all the presidents and I can say something significant about their policies. I think he will go down as the president with the most unforced errors. He continually hits the ball on the net on purpose, but we can't just be this derangement, So I asked my friends who are very anti-Trump, like, what's one thing he's done? Nothing. Well, then who's deranged? We're not talking about a rational, there's a ratio of rationality. You have to have the allowance that some of the things he has done, even if by accident, can be considered good.
Yeah. And this has been kind of a theme in the work that I've been doing in the last couple of years, where I've tried to look at what's actually happened and sort of leave the rhetoric and the tweets and everything else and all the panic, the crazy stuff about how the republic is collapsing aside. And it's not only lost me some friends, it's lost me a lot of jobs. Places that I used to write for, including I've written several times in the past for the New York Times, I can't seem to get through the door anymore. A perfect example was a year ago today, which was when the original summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un took place in Singapore. And prior to that, if you recall, the newspapers were full of stories about how Trump was going to start World War III in Asia with North Korea. And then when he sat down to meet with Kim, everything changed almost overnight. And suddenly he was going to give away the store to Kim. Yeah. And I tried to write some pieces that tempted to say, look, whether you like how we got here or not, this is what diplomacy is. You sit down with your enemies and you sometimes have to trade to get things. Diplomacy does not involve sitting down and telling your enemies what you want them to do, unless that comes, say, at the end of World War I and thing. And that didn't work out well either for historians out there. And so the idea that Trump was going to negotiate with Kim Jong-un was the antithesis of what everyone said Trump was all about, that he was a warmonger, a crazy man, a nutcase with his finger on the trigger. And yet those pieces that I wrote about that were rejected so completely that I couldn't find a place to publish them. No one wanted to hear that Trump had reached a point of diplomacy with North Korea that for one reason or another, 70 years worth of presidents had not achieved. They didn't want to hear that he was in a position to make peace. Now, the fact that it's not happened yet, again, people have leaped to conclusions. I've tried to write pieces explaining that we were at Cold War with the Soviet Union for decades before small steps were taken towards peace, where some classes of weapons were taken out. To simply say you've got to eliminate all nuclear weapons in your first year in office or you're a failure is a ridiculous statement, but yet that was what the media was telling us. And to voice something as obvious as, gee, history doesn't work that way, made me a Trump supporter to former friends who disowned me and made me unpublishable to some mainstream sources that once sought me out for advice. It's not sour grapes. It's simply what happened.
Yeah, well, I'll just offer you my platform. Anytime you want to publish something, I'll just take it and put it up. I don't pay very well, but yeah.
They don't pay that well either. Don't be fooled by that.
Okay, so let's back into this thing. And I want to get into Vietnam deferments, but you're right. Practical, rational assessment of history is that every president has left the next president a burden when it comes to North Korea. And look, we can't have it every single way. You can't say we're about to start World War III because Donald Trump is a madman. And then as he makes progress from the brink of World War III towards potential peace, you can't say he's screwing that up too. Like, ultimately, and this is the point I made to a lot of my friends who are against Donald Trump, like, you want him to succeed or you want there to be nuclear proliferation.
Yeah, take your choice.
Yeah, which one do you want? Even if he does it poorly, if we're getting away from nuclear proliferation, it's better. But we lose our sense of what is right and wrong over the fact that Donald Trump drives people crazy, which to me, without it being his fault, makes him a bad president because he just drives people bananas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, there's no question. But I see the same thing, for example, with pundits who see joy when we get a bad jobs report or when the stock market goes down or something. It's like, ooh, this is going to really nail Trump, isn't it? Well, yeah, it also potentially means hundreds of thousands, if not more, Americans are having a harder time economically. So throw them under the bus so that you can write a snappy take on Twitter about how Trump is. I agree with you. He's going to be remembered by history as a bad president, but I think, once again, perspective requires us. Did he, for example, at this point, has he started a war that set the entire Middle East on fire, killed 4,000 Americans, and squandered a couple of $1 trillion in the Iraqi desert? Gee, he hasn't done that.
Right.
He opened up prison camps and instituted torture of people as part of American policy? Nope, didn't do that either. Has he conducted drone strikes that have killed American citizens? Talking about Obama now, by the way.
Right.
Has he conducted drone strikes that killed American citizens? Nah, hasn't seemed to have done that either. Hey, how about invading Libya and kicking off a refugee crisis that may yet bring Germany and other countries in Europe to their knees? Did he do any of that? That was Obama too. Nope, didn't do that. So when we're claiming he's the worst president, the guy who's going to destroy democracy as we know it, end the republic, yada, 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 he's got some competition in those categories. And I know history will not see him as a strong president, a good president, an effective leader of the American people. Of course not. But I think the rumors of our republic's death have been greatly exaggerated.
Well, we are good at balance, and we are good at sort of, it's not that you get to have what you want. It's that we get to have what we can all tolerate. And if you're pissed off, it's probably working right. You could also say towards the George the Younger, he attacked our privacy and civil rights, the Patriot Act,
Yep.
Irrevocably so. And President Obama said, keep that stuff going. So it's, all of the hyperbole aside, it gets crazy. So I'm glad we covered that, but I want to get into putting some reality into the presidential election that's coming up and the candidates as we look at them. I mean, Joe Biden is the guy that everybody likes. And
is there an election? Is there an election coming up?
That's a little minor thing.
Has that been in the news, Pete?
A little bit.
Yeah, okay. I gotta pay more attention.
Without knowing anything about Joe Biden's platform, to include, I would say, Joe himself. And that's not fair, but I think it's pretty funny when you start to analyze a platform, how hard it can be to look at each plank and go, either one, how do you provision this? And two, where are the planks? But that aside, we struggle with Vietnam. And I know you've written about this. You talked about it on Tucker Carlson. Can you give us kind of your primer on Vietnam deferments and the draft and how we need to see this, since apparently we refuse to understand and remember how history works and then contextualize and pass it on to this time?
Yeah, absolutely. I was 15 years old when Saigon fell. And while at 15, the draft in place at that time may seem very distant, in fact, it was very much a part of my life. The United States was drafting people to fight the Vietnam War and to populate the military. And at 15, I understood there was a decision ahead of me. And the majority of my friends who had brothers or sisters who were older had these conversations around the dinner table. What should we do? And all of us in the small town that I grew up in Ohio, all of us saw soldiers, saw high school seniors go off. Some of them didn't come back from Vietnam. Some of them came back changed. Many of them came back with stories that they passed on to us. And so even though I was a little younger than those who faced these questions personally, it remains a part of my personal history. I've had the privilege of briefly meeting Ron Kovic. I've had the privilege of getting to know Oliver Stone. And your listeners will know that those men struggled mightily with the questions. Some of the greatest literature of that period of time, books like The Things They Carried, came out of the question of what should I do about the draft? What should I do about going to Vietnam? If anyone has had the chance to see Bruce Springsteen's one-man performance on Broadway or when it was on Netflix, he makes a centerpiece out of his decision to avoid the draft. He wasn't a rich person, obviously, at that time, but he went on a 3-day bender, messed his health up to the point where he purposely failed his Army physical, and continues to ask himself the question of what was the right thing to do. Pete Buttigieg, who's running for president of the United States, along with most of the media, has chosen to very selectively and hypocritically judge the decisions that Donald Trump made during that time in a different light than they have other candidates or that they have the decisions that were made in that time period. At the very minimum, Joe Biden, who is basically the Democratic nominee unless he screws something up, did not go to Vietnam. He had 5 student deferments, the exact same number that Dick Cheney, who was criticized for his actions, had. And Joe's final deferment, the one that kept him out of the war after he finished school, was that because he had suffered from asthma as a teenager, he was physically incapable of serving in the military. Now, Joe's autobiography talks about his high school football career. It talks about his summer jobs as a lifeguard and the life messages he learned from that. Doesn't sound as if asthma was a part of his teenage years based on that autobiography. But if you look at the Biden story, it seems very similar to the Trump story, where bone spurs in his foot kept him out of the military. At the same time, Mitt Romney got a student and a religious deferment to the military, did not go to Vietnam. Bernie Sanders kept applying for conscientious objector status. It's not clear, very unclear from the record. He won't answer the question whether he was ever granted it, but he kept the applications alive until he aged out of the draft process, and he did not go to Vietnam. George W. Bush joined a sweetheart deal with the local National Guard, as did former Vice President Dan Quayle, that assured them of a domestic posting that wasn't going to be particularly time-consuming or onerous as a way out of Vietnam. And famously, Bill Clinton pulled every trick in the book to avoid going to Vietnam, including at one point having a sympathetic ROTC officer falsely register him for a local ROTC unit long enough that Bill could arrange his scholarship to England and ride out his draft eligibility overseas at Oxford University, allegedly including a visit to the American Embassy in London, where he tried to or asked about renouncing his American citizenship. He was elected to office as President of the United States. And in fact, to put this in context, in 1992, when Clinton was running, the New York Times said Bill Clinton worked to avoid the draft, at times cleverly, but in ways that accorded with accepted common practice among others of his generation. Against that history, the Vietnam echo looks like an irrelevance that ought not to distract New Hampshire voters from judging Bill Clinton on his merits. To single him out as the sort of devious draft dodger does him, and the anguish of Vietnam, an injustice. It is literally impossible to imagine the New York Times saying those exact words about Donald Trump, and it is literally impossible to imagine the New York Times running investigative stories about Joe Biden's asthma, whether it was real or not, the way they have about Donald Trump. The selectiveness, the hypocrisy, and the idea that we have ignored the national mood that those men made those decisions within is shameful to me as an American. It's annoying as hell to me as someone who was walking towards those lines and those decisions himself, and certainly shameful to those who, in good faith, made tough decisions, either to serve or not to serve, and either to find an excuse, a bone spur or asthma, to go to jail, as over 3,000 Americans did, or to simply go to Vietnam and lose their lives, lose their limbs, lose their minds, because they chose that particular path. all are done a disservice from one end of the spectrum to the other.
Yeah, I want to make sure I say a couple things in response to that, because you're nailing it right on the head. So thanks for doing that. But I will say this about asthma. The military has a thing about asthma. As a kid, I had asthma, and I was athletic as heck all as I grew up. And so if I wasn't coached properly, I could have said I had asthma growing up as a kid. It hasn't bothered me ever since. Yep. And I easily would have been made ineligible for the military. If there was,
because, okay, fine. Yeah. Let's get Joe Biden on TV and let's ask him those questions.
Yeah.
Let's ask him whether his asthma was fake or not. The New York Times sent reporters out to interview the elderly daughters of the podiatrist who did Trump's bone spur diagnosis and wrote front page articles basically saying he's a liar, and candidate Buttigieg has called him a liar and a fraud. So if Joe Biden had legitimate circumstances, great, let's clarify that, but we don't want to talk about that.
Right. Yeah, well, that's the thing, right?
Those places.
Because it is a viable thing. And Joe Biden, or let's say Donald Trump's bone spurs, if there's not a medical record for it anymore, then what are we left with? You know, the memories of an old man who has seen tens of thousands of patients since then.
Well, no, his daughters. The podiatrist is dead. The New York Times interviewed his daughters who are now in their 70s.
Okay.
Did your dad ever talk about Donald Trump's feet at the dinner table?
Right. In anticipation of his impending presidency 70 or 50 years later. Yeah. Okay. So how we treat these things. And again, we talked about this off mic ahead of time. President Carter gave a blanket pardon to everybody up in Canada who was an American who had dodged the draft. This is how challenging this time was. Oh, and it turns out the government lied to us about the success, the capability for us to quote unquote win this war, something you and I are very familiar with in terms of what was reality. So to take a person who doesn't believe in the war that's happening, and heck, we had John McKay on the show. He's a Vietnam vet, and he knew well into his time as a lieutenant before even really going. He's like, this is unwinnable, the way we're approaching this. He could see it. Now, he still went, but there are several options. Run, hide, go. You know, and that's it. And I think in that case, any of these options in the context of that time is reasonable.
I also want to add, you mentioned about Americans who chose to go to Canada to avoid the draft. Over 100,000 Americans did that. That's a big number. And the idea here is to, again, help listeners who may not be familiar with this history to understand the context that these actions and decisions were taken in, which was very different than the world of 2019. Imagine 100,000 Americans marching off to Canada to avoid something here in the United States. It's a staggering large number. I think also, and I apologize for interrupting you, you know, the idea of the world of America was very different. We did not have the ethos during the Vietnam War of separating the warrior and the war. The way that we can respect someone for his or her service, for example, in Iraq, and realize that entire war was ridiculous. The way that we can separate horrible decisions that led to atrocities in Iraq from the men and women who were ordered to carry those things out. The pilot in Vietnam who dropped weapons on a civilian village was called a baby killer when he came home. The pilots who did the same thing in Iraq and Afghanistan, the wedding parties that were blown up by drone operators, we have a more nuanced understanding that those men and women were trying to do the right thing, that they were following orders, that they are not baby killers. They're people who were given wrong information. And we have that nuanced view of this now. That was not what was going on during the Vietnam War in America, where we associated the individuals who fought the war with the horrible decisions that were made at the highest levels about the war. And we don't seem to remember that. And so when candidate Buttigieg tries to retroactively open an old yearbook and say, you know, this guy, look at this, we're going to judge him in the light of 2019, it really does a disservice to everyone.
Well, and I think it undermines his intellect. It's one of the things that he leans upon, and also, and as you stated in your article that you wrote a couple days ago, and thank you for the quote, by the way. When he brings his service in as a discriminator for the presidency, then we have to evaluate his service at a higher level. I mean, Dan Crenshaw gets to say, "I'm a SEAL." Instant bona fides. We need to say nothing more. We obviously know what he does. But what Buttigieg did was he worked on a fob. He rarely left the camp. His job was to basically work a desk and make things happen for his boss. Was he in harm's way? Absolutely. Is he a combat veteran? Of course. But in his short tour, did he develop any kind of look? And this is 100% true. If he was to be on a patrol with me as a person that's got thousands of combat missions, I don't care who you are. Like, I have my eye on you to make sure that you need to be there, that you're a pro. And if not, then part of our attention has to be to make sure that you know what you're doing. He's not a pro. He would get the treatment of someone who is not validated to be there. So he doesn't have that. As much as he wants it, he doesn't have that. He served, he answered the call, all that stuff's heroic. But to put himself above anybody else who didn't serve, I mean, look, all of these politicians that have been working on policy for years have a huge leg up on him in terms of qualifications. So for him to take his minimal service record and make it into a differentiator, whether it's against his peers or Donald Trump, is really, I think, to me, inappropriate.
I agree. Now, I'm on very thin ice here in America in 2019, Pete, because I did not join the military. I was in the State Department for 24 years. And as you mentioned in your introduction, I spent a year in Iraq, forward deployed with combat units. I was outside the wire. You can look at it however you want to. You can call me a big pussy, or you can say that I earned my place. But I'm on thin ice because in America in 2019, we aren't nuanced in certain ways. And so criticizing military service or asking questions about it, let me say that, let's not say criticize, let's say asking questions,
Fair.
Is essentially a third rail. You just can't go there.
Right.
And with Buttigieg, he has taken advantage of that. He has said, look, I was a couple of months in Afghanistan. I did some driving for my boss, and I steered a desk behind the wire. I doubt he had a cold meal or ever slept a night off of clean sheets.
Yeah.
And that in isolation, there's no reason to touch that. There's no reason to criticize that.
Right.
Good for you.
Right.
And arguably what he did contributed something to the overall effort, and that's great. It takes a lot of people. Last time I checked, I think it's something like there's 17 people who don't pull triggers behind every trigger puller in the military. Okay. But that's fine. Freeze frame. Then, though, to say that has given me life lessons that prepare me for the presidency is, am I allowed to say bullshit on this show?
Yeah, I think, I'll say it. It's bullshit. You know, you don't get to throw the dramatic, while he was doing a reality TV show, season 7, I was packing my bags for Afghanistan.
For Afghanistan. That's what Buttigieg said. That was his
That's
quote.
his quote.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, if you kind of take the military part away and say, hey, one summer I helped my dad in his office with the books, is not a resume item for me to be chief accountant at Price Waterhouse. And that's what Pete is doing here. Mayor Pete is trying to take helping the equivalent in accounting terms of helping his dad with the books one summer and inflate it into, I can be a better president than someone who didn't do that.
Yeah.
If that is the case, if Pete's statement is accurate, then he should drop out of the race immediately, because Seth Moulton, who's a Democrat running alongside of him, had 4 serious combat tours in Iraq, including leading infantry Marines into Baghdad in the 2003 push. Tulsi Gabbard did 2 real tours in the Middle East, one in Kuwait and one inside of Iraq itself. So if Pete is going to claim that any military service is better than no military service, and that's the standard, great. We take you at your word, Pete. Please go away, because you are not the most hairy veteran in the race today. The line starts behind Seth Moulton, runs through Tulsi Gabbard, and you're in third place, pal.
Yeah. Let's also not forget that we seem to not like generals as presidents anymore. We're not comfortable with that. So why are we comfortable with an O2 or an O3 being a president? Like it's I appreciate that service matters, but we've gotten away from that.
It's very interesting, and I understand, of course, it's far more complicated than just to pull the Vietnam card out in isolation. But we've elected now two presidents who found their way out of Vietnam service, Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, and I'm going to count George W. Bush in there too. So let's say we've elected three presidents who have found their way out of Vietnam service, and we have rejected John McCain and John Kerry, who both arguably had pretty rough times in the war. Draw your conclusions as you wish. Like I said, I understand it's more complicated than that, but at the end of the day, when you add it up, the public has its thoughts about what happened in Vietnam, and Pete should really, with all due respect, just shut up about what he's doing. Yeah.
When you look at presidential resumes, are you related to President Van Buren? Is that part of your family?
I am not, actually. Okay. Martin Van Buren, as everyone knows, was both our eighth president and a previous Secretary of State, and one of the most corrupt presidents in American history. So in many ways, it seems as if he and I share some DNA here. But in fact, I worked at a place where there were a number of professional genealogists, and they actually, as a courtesy, helped me determine without any shadow of a doubt, I'm not related.
Oh, that's too bad. When we look at presidential resumes, we get really wound up on what is and isn't presidential. And I've tried to figure this out by just asking questions on Facebook. What are attributes? What are the qualities that we want in a president? And we say honesty, but yet politicians are known for lying. It's not like Donald Trump invented lying, but we struggle with this. And okay, so someone can have a weak resume, and I'll say that Mayor Pete Buttigieg has a weak resume. I'm confident in saying that because you look around at what does take to run this country. You've worked for the State Department. You know how complex of an organization that is and how hard that must be. And I don't know if you would even want the job as Secretary of State, but
only if you were president. Otherwise, no thank you.
Shots at 4 on Friday. Obviously, he's legally qualified, but can he really have a realistic claim to being prepared for that impossible? But that job is so hard, it kills people.
No, Barack Obama, Jimmy Carter are perfect examples. Both were extremely well-meaning people, I believe.
Yeah.
I disagree with them in various policy ways, but I do believe that both Obama and Jimmy Carter, just to pick those two, were sincere people. I think they had some good ideas that they thought they could put into play when they entered office, and they failed miserably because they truly did not understand, in even the simplest terms, how things work. Barack Obama, when he was elected in 2008, could have ordered rivers to flow in the opposite direction, and 90% of the American people would have supported him in that. And yet he failed to get many of his signature things passed. I don't want to open the can of healthcare,
Sure.
but what Obamacare ended up as was nowhere close to what he intended it to be, and an awful lot of his signature accomplishments ended up being simply executive orders. And when Donald Trump was elected, he crossed those out and said, "Well, they're no longer in action." And that shows you what happens when you don't understand how to manipulate and work with other parties and the bureaucracy, and you just go in there and do stuff with executive order. And Pete Buttigieg, Judge, if he even got as far as all this, would be a perfect example. He's been the mayor of a tiny little town in rural Indiana, and that's it. That's the set of experiences he has to bring. He's had some great education, but education is not the same as understanding how government begins to work. You cannot pick up the phone and call the State Department and say, "We're changing our policy in India on X, Y, and Z. Send me a note, when that's taken care of." The military pretends to say, "Yes, sir," and then the same problem. You don't just tell these giant bureaucracies what to do. In addition, everything you tell people to do has to be paid for.
Yeah.
And that means Congress. And someone who has no experience and enters under the divisive circumstances that the next president will enter under, whether it's in 2020 succeeding Trump or the guy after that, is going to have to be someone with enough experience in Washington that they can understand that. Now, if anybody thinks I'm trying to lay out the resume of Joe Biden, I will say that experience is not the same as baggage. And Joe Biden, while he's had a lot of years, he's been in Washington since 1972, kids. Ask your mom and dad where they were in 1972, and that's when Joe entered politics. And Joe had the experience and then passed that line and has moved into the point where it's all baggage now. We've seen that this last week with, for example, his former support of the Hyde Amendment, which prohibited federal financial support for abortions. Joe has supported the Hyde Amendment since the 1970s, and last week, when someone pointed this out, he then changed his mind on it. Joe was the leading prosecutor against Anita Hill when she made valid claims that Clarence Thomas, Justice of the Supreme Court, sexually harassed her, molested her. Joe Biden led the charge to degrade and humiliate Anita Hill. That was what his job was at the time, but that baggage is carried forward in a way that would not make him an effective leader in Washington. There's another point, though, I want to touch on with Pete Buttigieg, and that is to kind of bring this all forward. Pete wants to judge Donald Trump's actions in the 1970s in the pure light of 2019. So, fine, let's do some of that.
Okay.
Pete has said that his service in Afghanistan is something that has given him life lessons that Donald Trump will never have. Okay, point taken. That also, of course, scratches Joe Biden off the list. It puts Seth Moulton and Tulsi Gabbard ahead of him on the Democratic side. But more importantly, let's look at the life decisions that the other Democratic candidates post-Vietnam have made. Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, pick your others.
Yeah.
Prior to them, President Obama. Each of them had the opportunity to volunteer for the military and chose not to do so. Let's ask them, why not?
Yeah.
This argument that, well, someone else went in Donald Trump's place has validity to it. Someone else went in Bruce Springsteen's place and my place.
Sure.
Well, let's ask about that. Why didn't you, Cory Booker, raise your hand?
Yeah.
What were you doing? What were your priorities? And if serving in the military provides you with life lessons, if, as Buttigieg has said, we all owe the country something, he's a big proponent of some form of national service, whether that's military or in a civilian capacity. If that's true, well, why not ask Kamala why she didn't do it, or Cory Booker, or Elizabeth Warren, or any of the other candidates there? Why didn't they volunteer for the military? Barack Obama obviously had some other priorities. He went from one great school, expensive great school, to another great school, and he didn't go to the military. And why not? Why didn't you volunteer? Because Barack Obama, had he volunteered, would have been in Iraq or Afghanistan, and someone went in his place. And God help us, I hope it wasn't one of the thousands of Americans who never came home from those wars. But let's ask him.
This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business, or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
reach out to us on Twitter
at Pete A. Turner
or at JohnLG69.
at the Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show.
God help us, I hope it wasn't one of the thousands of Americans who never came home from those wars. But let's ask him.
Yeah, it's boy, it's a fair question to ask, and you're right. These things go both ways. The Joe Biden thing is interesting because he wasn't seen as a viable candidate 15 years ago. He just wasn't. He was a joke, if anything. Like, oh, that's Joe. respected as a senator, but not really sought after in terms of being the president of his party. But now it seems like being vice president has given him some kind of inertia that will put him over the top. And maybe he'll be the right guy. My question is given the challenges of being president, isn't it fair to assess with a clear transparency, crystal clear, the health of someone like Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden? Because we're talking about a job that wears people out. The demands are enormous. And I just don't know that an 80-year-old man should be president.
He's older than Joe Biden. He's older than Donald Trump. He's had multiple aneurysms, heart conditions.
Yeah.
He may have asthma. You've got to ask the question of at what point is this job too physically demanding for someone his age or Bernie Sanders' age? Because we have asked that question about Donald Trump. The media has constantly speculated about Trump's health. Yeah. When Trump releases his White House physicals, the media calls them lies.
Right.
When Trump releases his physicals, they say the doctors made up the numbers and left out important information. And now a new wrinkle, this is kind of unique in American history. The media has now embraced the theory that Donald Trump is mentally ill.
Okay.
Based on some goofy psychiatrists who have judged him based on his tweets and came to some bizarre conclusions that he is literally mentally ill to the point where he should be forcibly removed from office. So if we're going to ask the questions about old man Trump, I think we need to ask those same questions about older man Biden. Yeah. I'll point out also that while Trump's age and health, including his mental capacity, has been open game, the media scolded any conservative sources that ask those questions about candidate Hillary Clinton. So again, we're left with this hypocrisy. We're left with this unequal application. But even if we kind of sweep away the BS, there are sometimes questions in the middle of all this garbage that are valid questions to ask. And I think physical condition, more than age, you can be pretty much a mess at 45, and you can be in pretty good health at 75. Let's ask the questions, though, and see where those answers go, and not apply different rules to different fools.
Yeah, especially given the complexity and the requirements and how, it's a job that requires, it takes more physical examination to get a lot of jobs, to become a private in the Army than it does to become president. So, or
a truck driver.
You have to go in for a physical all the time as a truck driver, right? So this is something that, we want to know more about. Do any of the Democratic candidates strike you as one of my critiques of Kamala Harris and Cory Booker after their performance during the Kavanaugh hearings is that politics takes precedence. And I just don't think that we need that. I understand they're Democrats. They're going to push a Democrat thing. And the same thing with the Republicans. I'm neither of those groups. But I don't believe that Kamala Harris and Cory Booker like most of us. I think they dislike, if not hate, most of us. Am I wrong in having that assumption based upon their actions that you've seen?
No, I agree with you. Candidates like Booker and Harris are, I would characterize them as all appetite. Mm-hmm. They want to be president. They want the power. They want the recognition. They want the historical name. But they're not particularly interested in governing. They're interested in self-improvement. And they just want to eat, and votes are the food that they live off of. And I don't think they would make effective leaders because they're not interested in leading. They're interested in self-aggrandizement. And their records to date are very similar. When you see that folks who just kind of do a few things at this level and then they jump up here.
Yeah.
And then they do a few things at that level and then they come up here. And what they're trying to do is build that glorious political resume that makes them bulletproof. They want to create some B-roll along the way. And that's that. When they leave a trail of broken stuff behind them, Cory Booker, for example, did a miserable job as mayor of Newark and was sort of run out of town. Now, he failed upward, and that's always an admirable trait when you can pull that off. But it seems like just kind of a stepping stone. Pete Buttigieg falls directly into that category as well. So he goes, Oxford, check mark. Works at a big McKinsey, a good white-collar job, check mark. mayor of a little town in Indiana. Well, it's politics, check mark, because keep in mind, Buttigieg tried to be all sorts of other things first before he ran for mayor. Right? He wanted to be head of the DNC. He wanted a lot of other political positions, and he couldn't get any of those. And so he kind of settled on mayor of South Bend, Indiana, as if, getting the snow off the streets and picking up the trash is going to put him in a position to resolve the crises that will face him as president. These people are appetite. They're people who simply want to be president. And Biden is so obviously in that category. The man has failed twice to successfully run for president, embarrassingly so. Yeah. He settled in as Obama's dad as vice president at a time in 2008. America loved Obama, but was still a little cautious about him being. Did you know he was black?
What?
Yeah. Well, half. But they were a little bit cautious about him being young and inexperienced and black.
What?
And so, we appointed Joe Biden to be his dad. Obama turned out, pretty good, I guess. I mean, he didn't do anything irresponsible. So Joe just kind of faded into this role as court jester.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of your readers remember the ongoing series in The Onion, where they would make jokes about Joe Biden smoking weed and washing his Trans Am in the White House driveway and picking up chicks and stuff like that. And Joe became the court jester. And that was his role, because his original role turned out to be not needed. And now he's got one last swing at this. The Democrats are going to probably run him as candidate because he's less bad than everybody else.
So
it's not a good situation.
It's not a good situation because, frankly, I'd like to have someone come in and take their turn and really work on building some consensus. We've had this maddening tilting of the political scale. Hillary Clinton was pay for play before Donald Trump was. It's like we all forget that. We talk about the Mueller report, but we forget that she had an FBI investigation active for multiple felonies while she was running for president, which is, if you care about the country, that is an inappropriate position to put your party in and the nation into.
It's kind of a first.
Yeah, and it shocks me. Now, how can anybody in the Democratic Party think that is the way to go? It's unconscionable to think that someone who admits to committing multiple felonies accepts responsibility. These are her words. I accept responsibility. And then she's a candidate while this is going on. And then ultimately her husband talks to, Loretta Lynch in an unauthorized meeting the day his wife's getting deposed. And you can see the polls drop precipitously. Each time these things came out. And then it's Russia's fault that Donald Trump became president.
I play this game with a friend of mine where we hope we live long enough to know. It's like when you read a history book, right? You read about the Civil War in America. We sort of know everything, right? We've got all the documents and everybody's written their memoirs. And so you sort of have a pretty good idea what was going on. And even World War II, I mean, there's the secrets have mostly come out and who said what and everything. And my friend and I played this game where we hope we live long enough that someone will tell us what was really said on the tarmac between Clinton and Loretta Lynch, or what really went on in the negotiations between Hillary and the FBI to get her off the hook for her emails and things like that. So, I mean, the idea would be history needs 40, 50 years to wash these things through. So I'm kind of sad that I'm not going to probably live long enough to know those answers.
Have you ever been read on to TS-SCI in your career?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Have you ever been read on to TS-SCI access?
I had that clearance briefly, yes.
Did you ever get read on to a program, though, where you could actually access something in the
compartmentalized program?
Yeah.
We may have used different nomenclature in the State Department, but the answer, I believe, is yes.
Okay, so that when you walk into a SCIF, a specific, in our role in Iraq where we may have had TS clearances, but we weren't even authorized access to that part of the building.
Right.
Right. And that this is just for the audience, that whole network, that process is top secret. It's a closed network.
Right.
If the stuff leaves that network, someone has committed a crime.
Yes.
print off a copy, which you can do. You can print off a piece of paper that has got top secret on it, and you give it to someone else who doesn't have access. You have committed a crime, a felony.
Yes.
There's no way it can be on anybody's home server. It's just no way. It's impossible. Someone has purposely done that.
Yes. And I want to clarify that it's not necessarily the piece of paper. It's the information.
Yeah, it's the information
there. So this is where there was a sub-argument made that most or none or whatever of the stuff on Hillary's server was marked classified. And that sort of in some way absolved her of something. Right. I want to emphasize that it's the information itself, not the piece of paper, not the document. If the document says X, Y, and Z is happening in Russia, that piece of information is what's classified, whether it says top secret on the top of the paper or not. And if I hand an unauthorized user that information, or I whisper it in his ear, I'm committing essentially the same crime.
Right.
And so in Clinton's case, what was done in many instances was the designations for that this information is classified at this level were stripped off of documents, or they were excerpted out. People retyped stuff from a secret document into an open email.
Yeah.
And there was nothing to indicate that information was classified. And that supposedly meant that it was something, I don't know. It's the same thing.
Yeah, which is still a crime, the transposing of that information. And then when you receive something, and this is all in the briefing that everybody gets. It says, like basically things have to be classified. And if you see something, you go, I wonder why this isn't classified. You are bound by law to go to the person who handles classification and say, can this be out? This seems like this should be classified. Like, you're required, because mistakes happen. It's acts of omission or commission. There's no way out of it.
This was what was so frustrating to so many people who actually understood this system. And by so many people, I'm literally talking about millions of government employees, military and civilian, who work with classified information on a daily basis and understand that these are very simple rules. If it's not a machine or facility that is specifically designated to handle that level of classified information, then it doesn't leave that machine or facility. And if the person in front of you is not specifically authorized to receive that level of information, then you don't tell him or her that information. This is very simple. This is not complicated. And the idea that anything moved through a private email server, through an unclassified network, is so blatantly, obviously a violation of law, regulation, common sense, and a danger to the country itself. We all know overclassification is a problem, but some of the stuff that's classified is properly classified. It should be a secret. And if you, for your own convenience, move that information through an unclassified means, then you've done something really wrong. And if it doesn't rise to the level of a crime, it rises to the level of saying, why would we possibly want someone that freaking stupid to be president of the United States?
Yeah, it's and again, for the audience's sake to understand, when you go into a secure facility and there's classified information on walls, maps, locations of units, and Peter's going to come in, even if he has a clearance and doesn't need to know what's going on those walls, they stop everything in the office. They cover the walls. They'll have cloths or some kind of blocking device to cover that. People will turn their screens off, clear their desks so that Peter can come in. He's got permission to come in the building because of his access, but doesn't need to know what's going on. That is how seriously they take this stuff, especially at TS-SCI level. When you move TS-SCI, there's a whole protocol. There's a whole section of the rule book on what it takes to physically move a hard drive, a piece of paper, anything with classified information on it. It's impossible. And it just drives me crazy when people are like, well, what about the emails? Like, it's in any way not 100% illegal what she did. It just drives me nuts.
It was so obviously wrong. And again, it was this was not a gray area. This was not anything ambiguous. And to watch how it was twisted and manipulated, how the FBI decided to essentially say, hey, no blood, no foul, remains it's like the giant hemorrhoid of my political thinking that is just all past and now has basically degenerated into this myth that the election was stolen from her in some means by this process.
Ultimately, my ultimate thing was I couldn't, in good conscience, to all of my friends, because I've been one of these guys whose name is protected by a top secret document. I couldn't, in good conscience, vote and put them any more in jeopardy than they already are. I just couldn't do it. So I didn't vote for either of them, but I was prepared to vote for Hillary Clinton as the better option between the two. Not a good option, just the better. But ultimately, my conscience, you have to put your conscience. I couldn't do it. But let me ask you this. So now we take that and we go against this the Mueller report. We had a guest on recently who read the Mueller report and read it completely differently than you. And I'm not saying he's wrong, but when we think clearly these things happened, you've read the Mueller report, and from what I understand from what you've said, there isn't clearly any Russian involvement specifically with Donald Trump, like with his knowledge.
Yeah.
The only thing we possibly have is obstruction, and that kind of falls apart when the first part is untrue. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. As an assignment for the American Conservative, where I write regularly, I was tasked to read the entire report, and I did. I read it cover to cover. I also read lots of excerpts, summaries, things like that. I feel comfortable saying that I know what's in the report. Number one. Number two, it is a report. It's a 440 some page document, and it is intended it's in 2 volumes. First volume deals with Russia and whether Trump was connected, and the second one deals with the obstruction question. And it is designed to answer a broad questions. First volume is designed to answer the question of, did the Trump campaign work with the Russians, and we'll define those words in a moment, in some nefarious way. The second part is designed to answer the question of, did Donald Trump obstruct justice? And so you have to understand that's what the report was doing. So if you go back and cherry pick a line here and a footnote there and draw some conclusion, that conclusion has to be valid when you zoom out and look at the whole thing.
Okay.
It's the classic case of the 10 blind men feeling the elephant, right?
Yes.
Elephants are short, elephants have long noses, whatever. It's not valid unless it describes the whole thing. And so many of the people who think they know what the Mueller report is really saying, who think it's written in code or a roadmap or things, are actually picking pieces out that make some sense when they're looked at in isolation, but don't make sense when they're looked at in the totality of it.
Yeah.
The first part of the report is what the whole thing was about. This is why there was a Mueller, a special counsel, and before him, the FBI working on this issue. We will, for argument's sake, agree with Mueller that the Russians, in some form, attempted to, in some way, influence the election. I know there are arguments within that sphere, but we could be here for a long, long time sorting that out. How much was the Russian government versus simply Russians, how much influence they actually had. These are valid questions, but we'll assume for argument's sake that some Russian entity attempted to influence the election. Now, that happened independent of Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and it happened under the watch of Barack Obama, John Brennan, James Clapper, who were supposed to be protecting us from these things.
Okay.
So that went on, and it pulled in characters like WikiLeaks and things like that. Now, the question is, did Trump, in any form, the Trump world, the Trump campaign, actively participate in that process? Did they work with the Russians in some way? Now, to say that Trump, for example, as some critics of the Mueller report have said, Trump changed his messaging in line with WikiLeaks releases. Yes, but that's very different than a coordination. For example, the Clinton campaign changed their messaging in line with the Access Hollywood tapes. prior to the thing where Trump announced what he likes to do with women, the Billy Bush tapes, the Clinton campaign was messaging one way about the way he interacted with women.
Sure.
And when that tape came out, they changed their messaging. Are we claiming that they colluded with Access Hollywood? No, we're not. So the idea would be that did the Trump campaign in any form work with the Russians, interact with the Russians, cause the Russians to change what they're doing, do things, whatever, any of those words, any verb you want to use? And the answer, according to Mueller, is no, they didn't. People talk to each other all the time. Foreign governments are constantly probing campaigns because they know that one of those two people, Clinton or Trump, is going to be president, and they want to get in on the good side. And you can trust me that lots of foreign governments were interacting with the Clinton campaign in some ways. They just want to get to know the people, if nothing else. Okay, so the first part of the Mueller report is as unambiguous as it can be. There was no conspiracy, no collusion, no verb that you wanted to pick in there. You can bark all you want about meetings and phone calls and all this other stuff, but it simply did not happen that the Trump campaign actively worked with some entities in Russia to do this. That's very, very clear. How do we know it's clear? Because nobody got charged with it. No American in any way was charged with anything. Not Donald Trump, not Don Jr., not some low-level camp follower. Nobody was charged with working with the Russians. It's that straightforward.
Yeah.
You then move on to the second half, volume 2, which is really where all the action is these days. I don't think anybody on the Democratic side is seriously still talking up the Russians. I mean, they play at it, but I mean, it's kind of there. I don't know what Rachel Maddow talks about anymore. I don't watch the show. I can't imagine she has anything left to say. She's probably just doing reruns at this point. So the idea is obstruction. And the idea there is that Mueller points out, I think it's 10 different things that Donald Trump did which could be considered obstruction. And he tries in the report to lay out the three crude factors that have to be in place. One is that the act had to be or attempt to be obstructive. It had to be done with the intent to obstruct, and it had to have been aimed at the investigation. It couldn't be something random or off the, and he lays these out for these 10 things. And this is where the Democrats are poking and are going to be holding hearings from now until Election Day in 2020, is to parse this all out. When you read through them, it's obvious that whoever wrote the report thought some of these were a lot closer to the legal definition of obstruction than others. Some of them fell into some very gray legal areas about if the president could legally do something, could you call that an illegal act?
Yeah.
In other words, if the president legally was able to fire James Comey, which he was, could you actually say that his legal action was a crime?
Right.
Now, it's not very clear, but the answers to those questions, they get into some very complicated legal territory, even before you bring up the fact that it's the president of the United States. Mueller, at the end of his report, 440 pages, came to a default conclusion. In other words, the report does not say this is an act of obstruction. It does not say, had it been anybody but the president, this would be considered an act of obstruction. It does not say this is so complicated that it must be resolved by impeachment. There are places in the report, the line that a lot of Democrats have pulled out is that something, these issues can only be resolved through an additional process or something along those lines, which everyone understands to be impeachment. That is a statement of fact. It is not a call to battle. In other words, if you said to me, hey, Peter Van Buren, the president took a completely legal act firing James Comey, but it seems like it ended up doing something for illegal means. How do we sort that out? The answer is the only way that can be judged is via impeachment. There's no other platform that allows that to be judged. So I'm giving you a factual answer to a factual question. I'm not saying, and please start the impeachment right away.
Yeah.
So they've gone to all these things where they're down to the point where the Democrats are reading this report like it's the Dead Sea Scrolls or it's something that Dan Brown wrote. Where if you take the first letter from each paragraph and play it backwards, it's Hey Jude. And so the idea is that at the end of this all, Mueller was perfectly free to say, and therefore this must be resolved by the House. Or therefore, I would have prosecuted had it not been the president. Or therefore, in order for this to go forward, we must first resolve the question about whether the president of the United States can be indicted. There's all sorts of things he could have said. He wasn't a hostage. He wasn't chained to the wall in Bill Barr's basement, communicating by blinking his eyes at us. Right. He was perfectly able to say what he needed to say in this report and conclude what he wanted, how he wanted to conclude it. And the way he did conclude it is with no indictments, no roadmap, no calls to action, no final section saying, here's what happens next. He simply laid out the evidence that he uncovered in the course of his 2-year investigation that showed clearly there was no canoodling between the Russians and Trump, and gathered this information about obstruction to the point where he chose not to indict, prosecute, recommend, suggest, or anything else. In the world of prosecutors, it is a binary world. You either prosecute or you don't. Pete Turner is found on the street in possession of a whole pile of 20 bottles of liquor. The store on the corner says some guy who looks like you just ran in and grabbed 20 bottles of liquor. The prosecutor, the police and the prosecutor gather facts, and at the end of that, they either prosecute you for robbery or they don't.
Yeah.
You either go to court or you go home. And if you go home, that's it. Have a drink on me. And Robert Mueller chose not to prosecute. And whatever you read into his report, at the end of the day, you have to understand that that's what he did. And he was given a second opportunity to, kind of nuance it a little further in his press conference and to say whatever he wanted to say. Again, there was no one putting a gun to his head. And he basically said, the report speaks for itself. The actions that he took are clear. And at that point, you cannot conclude anything different about the report.
Yeah.
The House can, in fact, open impeachment proceedings today. They have 448 pages of information in front of them that they're welcome to plow through and take a vote on. But they're not going to do that. They're afraid to do that because they know that information clearly in the eyes of Robert Mueller and the Department of Justice, who I understand we now label as a bunch of stupid cucks, and therefore they're all on the hook to Trump. And Bill Barr is a trite. We've kind of shuffled them off stage by labeling them as terrible people. But there's a lot of smart lawyers who have come to the same conclusion here. The fact that journalists seem to see clarity in all this, that the people who are actually charged with doing something don't, is by itself a significant tell. I'd rather not hear some guy who writes for the New York Times tell me the Mueller report is a clear roadmap. I'd rather hear someone in the House whose job it is to push impeachment forward to say, we're going to impeach this guy on the facts in the Mueller report. But they haven't said that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so for people that don't understand, when you have a military person do a briefing, they understand exactly what to say. There's this thing we have called bluff, bottom line up front. Bottom line up front is we have to prosecute. Bottom line up front is there's not enough evidence to do anything here. You guys are welcome to look at more stuff if you want to, but here's the report. Mueller is not afraid to say exactly what he thinks, and he's done that. And he reiterated it in his announcement. So you're 100% right. And then the same reporters that constantly wanted this to happen are the same ones that said that it's not a problem. It's cool to have TSSCI on a server in someone's garage. And as the spy in me says, let me know where there's exploitable information, because I will absolutely undermine and I will accomplish my mission. Nothing will stop me And if something does stop me, there's another me behind me that's trying from another angle. So that stuff is uncoverable. We didn't find anything. I'm not saying President Trump is a great guy. I think he's an asshole. But
agreed.
But to draw this thing out, it only undermines the nation and the Democratic Party's ability to focus where the attention ought to be. If you cannot beat Donald Trump in a straight up election, then why are you going to run the country? Get serious about this. Gather people, quit trying to divide everybody, quit doing the party first, and go after, because the bottom line is this: you're going to have to run against a president that's going to say, I delivered on promises. You can disagree with him, but he's going to say it. He's going to point the numbers on the wall, and he's going to be right to tens of millions of people, regardless of what we do. So if we're going to be serious about this, it cannot, at some point, we have to take this seriously and stop throwing Hail Marys.
Yep. And stop embarrassing ourselves by believing that the President of the United States is a actively run agent of the Russian intelligence services. That's an embarrassment to everyone in America. It's a shameful thing that we're actually claiming it. It harkens back to the McCarthy era, where simply accusing someone of being a communist was enough to destroy them and their careers. We lost so many good people in government through that process. And to attempt to drag that crap forward and use it against the president with no evidence, we have it now. Robert Mueller spent 2 years looking, and prior to Mueller, the NSA, the CIA, the entire technical and means of the United States was deployed on this topic. Trust me, they looked.
Yeah, they do. They look at everything. I mean, they've got the ability to look at everything. It's what they examine. Okay, well, listen, I've had you for an hour. It's been fantastic. I always love when you come on. Thank you so much for doing that.
Is this the interview? I thought we were just talking. I thought you just called up to kind of hash through these things with me. This is the interview? Wow, this is a great show. Break it down.